Good evening and welcome to Q&A. I'm Tony Jones and here to answer your questions. Small business operator, committed Christian and People's panellist Ash Belsar. The Shadow Minister for Infrastructure, Catherine King. Centre Alliance Senator Rex Patrick, who will play a critical role on the crossbench when Parliament resumes. The Executive Director of Change.org, Sally Rugg. And the re-elected Federal Minister for Education, Dan Tehan. Please welcome our panel. Thank you very much. Q&A is live in Eastern Australia on ABC TV, iView and News Radio. Well, there's plenty to discuss tonight. Let's go straight to our first question. It comes from Tony Manane.
My question is for Dan Tehan. Dan, as a Catholic, can you see that Israel Folau quoting the Bible on social media in relation to the various types of sin, and given that he fully believes what the Bible teaches, is actually attempting to help people, to help them repent so as to be saved and therefore avoid hell? So that what he was doing cannot be so much classified as hate speech, but rather the opposite, and is in fact a brave act of love for those he is trying to help come to God.
Well, I think what the Israel Folau case shows us is that we need a Religious Discrimination Act in Australia, because what isn't clear at the moment is how we define the boundaries about what is, what we should be free to say and what we shouldn't, especially when it comes to our religious faith. We have it for sexual discrimination, we have it when it comes to disability, we have it when it comes to age, but we don't have anything which defines the boundaries in Australia properly when it comes to religious discrimination. And I think that's the key takeout and key lesson from the Israel Folau case, and it's why the government took to this election a policy where we wanted to see a Religious Discrimination Act put in place, and my hope is that we'll be able to see that done through this term of Parliament.
So Dan, the obvious question, if the kind of Religious Discrimination Act that you wanted to see was in place, would it stop Rugby Australia sacking Israel Folau for saying what he said?
Well, that's a hypothetical, Tony, and one I can't answer because we haven't got the Religious Discrimination Act in place.
What's the point? In a case like this, what would be the point of the law? That would be the key question.
Well, the key point would be that we would have a law which would set some parameters and some boundaries, and we don't have that at the moment, and that's why we need it. We have it when it comes to sexual discrimination, we have it when it comes to age discrimination, we have it when it comes to other forms of discrimination, but the boundaries are not clear at the moment when it comes to religion, and that's why I think we need a Religious Discrimination Act.
Okay, where are they in your mind as the potential author of such a bill? Where are the boundaries in what Israel Folau said, that homosexuals and a variety of other sinners in his mind were going to hell?
Well,
so, I mean, he said that publicly. It's been construed as hate speech by some. How do you construe it?
Well, we've got to look at finally what the Parliament would say are those bounds, and my point is at the moment we don't have those boundaries in place, so we don't know.
But you'll be in government and you'll be making the
Yes.
decisions on what the legislation says, so what you'll be pushing for at least, unless it's amended. So in this case, would it be okay for someone to say what he said?
Well, let's wait and see what the Parliament decides. Let's wait and see what the Cabinet decides the final makeup of a Religious Discrimination Act would look like. Let the Parliament set the boundaries, then let the courts test it, let the workplace relations laws test it, and then let's see as a society where we should draw the bounds. But at the moment, we don't have those bounds. And the United Nations clearly sets out that one of the fundamental rights is the right for religious freedom, yet we don't have that set in our laws here in Australia,
Okay,
and that is what we
I'm
should be doing.
I'm going to press you one more time.
Yeah.
Do your instincts, does your conscience tell you that he should have been able to say publicly what he said without recriminations?
Well, I haven't seen his contract that he has with
No,
Rugby
I'm talking
Australia.
about what he said.
Well, he has the right to say and to practice his religious beliefs, and that's what he's done. Now, I don't know what the contract was that he had with Rugby Australia, so I can't go into the rights and wrongs of that, and I think that'll play out in the courts. But he should have the right to practice his religious beliefs. That's been a fundamental that we've taken as a given in Australia, but what we're starting to see is that we haven't got clearly defined boundaries anymore when it comes to religious discrimination, like we do with sexual discrimination, like we have with age discrimination, like we have with disability, and that is why we need a Religious Discrimination Act in Australia.
Okay, Sally Rugg, what do you think about a Religious Discrimination Act which could potentially make legal, completely legal, what Israel Folau said in his Instagram feed when he said homosexuals and a number of other sinners should or will go to hell because of the sins they're committing unless they repent?
Mm-hmm. So I do want to answer that question about a Religious Freedoms Act, but I just kind of want to pause for 1 second because I feel like we've been doing Q&A for like 4 minutes now, and already we've had like several people repeat the claims that someone like me is going to go to hell unless I repent, or there's something vague about me needing to be saved, and that was an act of kindness for someone to say that I would need to be saved. And I think it's really important, you know, we kind of bandy these words around and these ideas around as if it's some sort of philosophical argument, and as if these words don't mean things and they don't do things.
What do they do for you and other people from, let's say, the lesbian or the gay community?
Sure. I mean, I'm not going to repeat some of Folau's words, but he made a disgusting comment about transgender children. And that comment doesn't just exist in a vacuum. That comment exists in a reality where if you're a teenager in Australia who's transgender, you have a 1 in 2 chance of attempting suicide. 1 in 2. And the words that Folau uses about gay Australians, people like me, they exist in a context where the Morrison government is currently looking at whether people really care or not that religious schools can exclude LGBT teachers and students. So how do they make me feel? They make me feel a bit sick. They make me feel tired. I feel confused as to why in 2019 we're having this sort of like esoteric discussion about whether it is really harmful for these words to just sort of be bandied about in our society.
A national debate started by a rugby player,
That's
which is
right.
quite unusual, I think.
Yeah, but in terms of a Religious Protections Act, I mean, protections are there to protect people. Protections are meant to be shields, and so I wouldn't want to see any sort of Religious Protection Act that takes away the protective shield that anti-discrimination laws have for people like me and the more vulnerable members of my community.
Okay, I'll go across the panel. Ash, what do you think? The question was, were Folau's actions a brave act of love for those he's trying to help come to God? You're a Christian, what do you think?
Yeah, very, very good question. Thanks, Tony. And I guess it's no surprise that Christians and a number of other religions and people of faith do have those beliefs. We do hold it very clearly, and we don't just hold it for other people, we hold it for ourselves. We do hold ourselves accountable. I think Israel Folau's list, as you would have seen, was quite extensive. If it was a list for me, it would have been 3 pages long, I can guarantee you. And my wife's here to verify how often I trip up. And it is a strict kind of a rule, and I do feel Sally's pain because words can hurt, I agree with that. We can't just brush it off and say, oh, freedom of speech, and I am a clear believer in freedom of speech, and we do need to be thoughtful. With rights do come responsibilities, but the hurt and fear actually does go both ways. I was talking to a friend recently and she was involved in the marriage campaign. She had just received a promotion. She'd just had, her contract was about to come to an end. They said, don't worry, there's heaps of work. She was involved on the no side in the campaign. She got back, it was a government entity and they cancelled her contract. Well, not cancelled it, finished, but sorry, no work. So the fears are actually a little bit both ways on this. Many of us people of faith go, well, what is going to happen if we speak out? Can we lose our jobs? And where is the boundaries? It's actually quite confusing. But I guess for a lot of us, these are issues that go to the depth of our conscience. And I mean,
so what does your conscience tell you about the notion that someone's nature that is their sexual nature, could condemn them to eternal hell, which is essentially what he's saying in a Christian
And that is a
context.
fantastic question, because all of our essential nature sends us directly to hell according to Christ. And the whole thing is, Jesus said, I came not to condemn the world but to save it. But then the big question becomes what? And so for a lot of our point of views, whether you agree with us or not, we often look at something and go, is that harmful? And I actually tend to think, even if I look like an idiot or a fool or lose my job for it, if I don't want something, I actually feel the weight of that on my conscience that I actually didn't say something. So I think that's where Folau's probably coming from here. And I think that's where a lot of us come from on this situation.
Okay, Catherine King, what do you think? And we need to reflect on the notion of a new act, a Religious Discrimination Act.
Well, I mean, the first thing I would reiterate Sally's points that, these words do great harm. The fact that people and children and young people from, LGBTIQ have bigger, more mental health problems because of discrimination is a very serious issue, and you can't just dismiss that. We do have protections for people practicing religion. It's enshrined within the Australian Constitution, and there have been a number of High Court cases that say when are you practicing your religion and when are you not. And with any issue of rights, there is always a balance between an individual's rights to practice their religion and an individual's rights then to discriminate or not be discriminated against. I think the balance is right. I think this debate that is fuelled obviously by Folau at the moment, I think is stirring up again a huge anxiety amongst a group of people, or lots of people, that I think is really unnecessary. Go back to what the Australian Constitution says. We have yet to see what the government is proposing. I think it's going to be very difficult for the Parliament to say this is what you should be able to, you can say and you can't say. I think it will be almost impossible for the Parliament to actually do that. I think it is enshrined in the Constitution. The High Court has already interpreted it.
So just very briefly, Ash wants to jump in, I'll come back to him. Just very briefly, are you saying that Labor's position in principle would be against a Religious Discrimination Act?
We'll have a look at whatever the government proposes, but I think it will be really difficult for the Parliament to say, what is it that you can't say now that you want to be able to say that potentially will infringe on a whole group of other people's rights and potentially do harm? That's the question the Parliament will be asked, is what can't you say now that you want to be able to say? And from my point of view, if it is something that harms and discriminates against another group of people, then I don't think that we should go down that pathway.
Well, we know precisely what Israel Folau said.
Yeah, I think what he said was wrong.
What he put on his Instagram.
Wrong, and I don't think it was practising his religion by saying it.
So, but if there were a Religious Discrimination Act that said it was right, it would be in conflict potentially with the employment code that Folau signed up to. That would mean it would actually end up going to the High Court for a decision.
Absolutely.
Just want to quickly remind, we have been repeating Israel Folau's allegation this evening on national television. People still have the right to say that I'm going to hell. This isn't something that is currently illegal and we're trying to make legal. People can already do that.
Yeah, okay, quite a few people in this audience potentially, and more broadly would also be going to hell according to Folau. Ash, you want to jump in and then I'll come to Rex.
One of the things, you may need to clarify this on my behalf, I believe the Instagram comment was actually private, and I'm assuming someone tried to find it. I don't know that, I just read...
No, I don't think that's correct.
Okay, that's fair enough, I'll leave it.
What's more, he seems to have chosen a time to do it when he became the highest try scorer in Super Rugby, and that very evening, having achieved that milestone, he put out this Instagram feed. But anyway, let's move on. Rex.
Very loving.
Yeah, so I disagree with what Israel Folau said, but nonetheless, these are very tricky issues. Trying to balance off freedoms with tolerance. There are always boundaries. Freedom of speech. We've seen some boundaries crossed, in my view, with the government recently initiating raids on journalists. So that's a freedom of expression constraint that's been playing out in the media over the last week or two.
We're going to come to that in detail in a moment.
I understand that. So we find that if, for example, it's speech which incites violence, we have very little tolerance for that. If it's to do with defamation, we find there's a different line. So there's no easy answer on this, and the Parliament can attempt to legislate, but of course it's always going to come down to the circumstances of the case. One quick example: when if you're standing in front of a group of school children in a religious school, and you say that in accordance with my faith, marriage is between a man and a woman, most people would say that's okay. If you then suggest it's a sin, it starts to get perhaps a little bit more confrontational. And then if it gets carried out into the schoolyard by kids calling someone who's LGBTQI a sinner, it has a different context.
Or possibly suggesting my football idol says you're going to hell.
Yeah, all those sorts of things. So it's very difficult. The Parliament's going to have struggled to get this right. Generally what we see happens is general boundaries are set, and then places like courts then interpret it, looking at the circumstances of where the speech took place, and making a decision that guides people.
All right, so you might be sitting on a crossbench which has the duty to decide whether to allow a Religious Discrimination Act to become law. How do you think you would resolve that issue?
Okay, so once again, haven't seen any legislation. We'd have to look at that, but I can almost guarantee people that when such a bill came before the Senate, we would refer it to a Senate inquiry, and we would ask to hear the perspectives of all sorts of people, whether they be religious, LGBTQI, hearing from institutions, hearing from schools, hearing from mums and dads, hearing from kids. And that's the sort of thing we'll do in the Senate. We'll send it to a Senate inquiry, and we will examine everyone's perspective and try and find where the unintended consequences are and try and strike the right balance.
Sally,
yes,
you could find yourself having to give evidence at a Senate inquiry. Would it be a sense of déjà vu, in the sense that you had to be involved in a big discussion about same-sex marriage not that long ago?
Oh, right. Yeah, it wasn't that long ago, was it? How would I find the Senate inquiry?
Well, you might be called as a witness as to whether something like a Religious Discrimination Act could cause offence if it allowed comments like Folau's to become basically legal tender.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to. I think I'd have some really useful things to say.
What might you say?
I think I would talk about how words do things and words mean things, and that people can have as much religious freedom as they like as long as it doesn't encroach on other people's freedom or other people's safety. I think we have the capacity to get the balance right.
Okay, let's move on. We've got another question. It's also related to free speech issues. It comes from Keith Foster.
My question is for Dan Tehan. Your recent review concluded that claims of a freedom of speech crisis on Australian universities was unsubstantiated, and characterised the problem as, and I quote, a relatively small number of high-profile cases which have attracted publicity. However, I'm a casual academic at a large university and an advocate for free speech, and it's clear to me that there is a loud minority of activists on campus aggressively censoring free speech. And I don't think the recommendations of the report address how to change the culture at the grassroots. So what can you do about that?
Well,
it's a very good question, and I think trying to change the culture of universities if free speech is being impinged is going to take a lot of work and a lot of effort. But the reason that I asked Robert French to undertake his inquiry was because it was put to me that there were concerns that free speech and freedom of academic inquiry weren't getting the freedom that they deserved, and that it needed to be looked at. And Robert French did a very good, thorough review, and
we should make the point that he's a former
justice,
Chief Justice of the
former Chief Justice of the High Court, and he did a very thorough review. And you're right, he said there wasn't a crisis, but he said that there were over 110 laws, codes, regulations, which each in a way could impinge on freedom of speech or freedom of inquiry.
So Dan, I'm just sort of to
Yep.
condense it a little bit, he's recommended a model code.
That's right.
Under his code, as I understand it, he concludes that universities would have the duty to protect staff and students from discrimination. So does that mean, for example, that if Israel Folau were invited to talk at a university and say the things he said his Instagram feed, that could hurt members of staff or students at the university, as Sally has suggested, and therefore the universities had every right in the world under the French Review to stop him from speaking?
Well, my hope would be that under such a model code where freedom of speech was paramount, and if Israel Folau was there and he was there saying that these are his beliefs and that is why he wanted to express those views, that under a model code that he would be able to express those views at a university campus under the context that he was there. And because in the end, that code, freedom of speech and freedom of academic inquiry, is seen as paramount.
But what I'm saying is
Yep.
that the French Review code actually gives the universities the right to say no. What he's saying is going to hurt members of staff, possibly, and students, possibly, so he shouldn't speak.
No.
So the code actually gives them the leeway to stop him from speaking.
Well, it would depend on the circumstances on which he was on the campus. It would also depend on how it was interpreted. But my hope would be that he would be able to go there and express his fundamental beliefs on that campus and do so. And my hope would be that someone like Sally could be there and could express her fundamental beliefs if they were contrary to what Israel Folau is saying. We have to be able to, especially on university campuses, to be able to have these types of debates. And that is my hope, that we will see that as a result of this code, because if we can't have them on university campuses, then I worry that free speech will be stifled in other places and future generations will suffer as a result.
What if I came along? What if I came along to express my view, but I brought a whole bunch of my mates with me and they expressed the same view all at the same time? Maybe we have some signs or something. Someone's made a petition and we're all expressing our view all together online at once. There's hundreds of thousands of us. How come we're not allowed to do that? How can we have this thing called free speech without the freedom of protest?
Of course you can do that. No one's saying you can't do that, and you should be able to do that. I mean, that is so fundamental to our democracy. You should be able to do that.
Thank you so much. So
Well, don't thank me. Thank the Australian people, thank the Australian Constitution, thank all those who have fought long and hard for liberal democratic principles. This isn't about me, it isn't about this parliament. This is about something we should cherish, which has made this country the thing it is today and made Western democracies what they are today, and we have to hang on to that.
Let me just quickly go back to our questioners. I'll come to you in a second, Ash. Our questioner asked, so you're an academic at a university, you're worried about free speech. Could you imagine your institution allowing Israel Folau a platform to say the things that he said on Instagram?
I would find it hard that they would let him on campus. I think he wouldn't be allowed, but I can imagine...
He's a rugby player, not an AFL player.
Yeah, well,
Go Tigers.
if he was going to speak about what his tweet was about, I don't think he would have much of a chance of getting approved.
So you've had a look at the French Review. It seems to me that would give the university the right to stop him if anything that he said would hurt the students.
That would give
my personal view is I think that's a pretty restrictive view of the code and what Robert French is saying in that code. I think, look, it would depend on maybe some individual university policies, but I think the code broad enough and that paramount freedom of expression of academic inquiry, I think in most cases would allow Israel Folau onto a campus if he was invited onto that campus by a group from that university, then I think he would be able to come on and we would be able to have the type of debates we need to be having.
Okay,
in this
all right.
nation.
Ash, you wanted to get in, then I'll hear from the other panelists.
Yeah, thanks for that, Tony. It was just to just to answer this gentleman's question more directly, or add something to it. It's kind of funny, when I was at university, I was a fine arts student. You could say whatever you want to get away with it. I'm still trying to figure out years later why we had to study Marx's Das Kapital for art history, but I think they wanted me to share my paintbrushes or something. But to your question more directly, I was speaking to someone yesterday who actually raised the same thing. It was at church, so maybe it was a ScoMo miracle for this question, but he said he knew people in your situation. But looking a bit further into it, I was just reading about the scientist Peter Ridd, I believe his name was, from I think it was James Cook University. Now, he was speaking on an issue of science, and he was a professor in that faculty to the best of my knowledge, and he'd critiqued some of the work on the reef, or the reef bleaching, and for that he was sacked. Now, he's won his case, but I do wonder how many other people are afraid to speak out in case they lose tenure. Now, for my business and my lifestyle, I'm completely outside. That's what I do. I'm an outdoors person. I run an outdoor activities business. And the environment, and a clean environment, is so important for what I do. But I do wonder, as we're trying to move ahead with environmental issues, climate change, whatever, that there's a very fair, reasonable and justified suspicion with people in the public that we're not getting the full picture, and that if someone had an alternative view on climate change, maybe it's not heard. And the fundamentals of it with science is, if science isn't questioned and it isn't scrutinised, it's clearly not real science. But my thought is, on these sort of issues, is that maybe one of the best ways ahead is potentially to open up the marketplace to new universities, maybe ones with fresh ideas. You may have students come along who buck the trend, challenge the status quo, but I would have thought that's what universities were all about.
Catherine, let's start with the potential model code and the French review.
Sure. Again, this is, we're having a discussion about rights, which is terrific because we should be having a discussion about rights in this country and about, are our rights protected. Universities, free speech is incredibly important, but again, it goes to that issue. If we're then allowing hate speech on universities, if we're allowing speech that can do great harm, then we do have to think about what is the balance of what we're providing, what is actually being allowed.
So are you saying that deplatforming is okay in certain circumstances?
Well, I think that, I don't know what this code or what it would look like, but I think it's important to, again, if you're having a discussion about rights, it is always about balance and about the, individuals versus the greater good. All of those things are really important. And if that's what you're trying to do at universities, I know a number of universities are already sort of developing their own codes. So long as you're not allowing hate speech, you're not actually allowing harm to be done to people. And the Folau case, I think you have to think about that, about the harm. And I think, people are not really understanding that the harm that does. Then it's good to have a discussion about these things.
Tony, I just need to be clear. This isn't about hate speech.
Well, sometimes it is, Dan. That's the problem.
One of these issues, and like is, eye of the beholder, and that's one of the issues, and that's where rights compete against each other. But
hate speech isn't in the eye of the beholder, though. That's something that is like a classified speech.
No, like hate speech, we don't want hate speech of any kind. That's absolutely. But it's very easy for people to say a certain amount of speech is hate speech, to try and then impinge on that speech. So once again, how do you define it? And my view is, if you wanted to have a discussion about religious freedom on a university campus, so you're talking about people's fundamental religious beliefs, you should be able to, if you're a group on that university, if you wanted to, is ask Israel Folau to come along and debate that topic. And I think, it's just as much of a right that you can be there to put your point of view.
But Dan, is that group allowed to protest around the university campus en masse, holding up protest signs, saying that if you're an LGBTI student, you will go to hell? And that's what Sally just
then what's changing? It feels like this is what is already happening. People go at controversial speakers sometimes come. There's sometimes protests. What are you proposing to change?
So what we're changing is we're making sure that freedom of speech is paramount when it comes to universities. So that type of activity is enshrined, because what the former Chief Justice of the High Court showed was that we're getting rules and regulations, over 110 of them now, which could be impinging on freedom of speech. So therefore, what we need is a model code which clearly defines that this is the type of practice that can occur.
I'll make the point, Dan, one more time, and I think there is a little bit of confusion around this, but it does seem that the model code allows universities to say this speaker could harm staff or students, therefore we're not going to allow them to speak. So in fact, the model code might do, well, it could. Yeah. Because that gives the university the right to decide, isn't that right? Yeah, but there is a delineation between whether a group on campus, someone who is a member of that university, invites that person onto the university, or whether an outside group or an individual invites themselves to speak on that university campus. All right. And I'm going to move on to just another aspect. Ash, sorry, okay, quickly. You can come in.
Well, no, I was just going to ask something across to Sally. It's kind of funny. I feel like I'm on the far left and you're on the far right on this one, as the audience looks. But anyhow, when it comes to when you're talking about protests, I 100% agree everyone has a right to protest, because it's so important to a functioning democracy. It's where you draw the line between protest and obstructing other people's freedom to speech, and also their freedom to associate, which I've felt. I've been to events before where they tried to block me and hit me for going and whatever. But on the flip side of that, in Victoria, in the last few years, around abortion clinics, for example, you can't protest within 150 metres. Good. Would you? Thank goodness for that. But the thing is, would you be happy for that if a speaker of another nature, like, that you didn't appreciate, you couldn't protest within 150 metres? Should we make it fair both ways?
I don't think you can compare like transphobic YouTubers to women accessing healthcare.
Yeah.
But we are talking about a democratic right that, and the whole thing is, whether you agree with someone or don't agree with someone, it's a right that's fundamental to democracy. And if you take this away, you actually move away from democracy into more of a groupthink where anyone who says the wrong thing, they don't even get a choice. Because if someone believes the wrong thing to you, how do we decide who's believing right and who's believing wrong? But the fundamental right to protest is very important, providing it doesn't include obstruction.
All right, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to put a line under this one, because we could go all night on that subject. Thanks. The next question, again, it's kind of moral issue about freedoms and individual rights, from Catherine Coffey.
Thanks, Tony. I support the new assisted dying laws, in spite of the fact that I was brought up in the Catholic faith and am a retired nurse. In my experience, the best palliative care does not always make for a dignified, peaceful, pain-free death. I therefore respect people who make this choice, especially if they are suffering from a terminal illness or a degenerative condition where they no longer have quality of life or are totally incapacitated. Surely, if a person of sound mind takes this option, it is their human right to die as they please. Why doesn't Ash support this assisted dying legislation?
So Ash, we'll start with you. You're back on deck.
Thank you so... Like, I don't like speaking as it is, but thank you so much for the question. It's a really important question. And more to the point, I used to be like, why should I even care? It's someone's freedom of choice. I might morally disagree with it, but it really is up to them. And to be honest, when I looked into it just a little bit further, I did have a few concerns on this issue. And one of the issues that really came to my attention that I was quite frightened about is currently we have safeguards in place. Yet initially when Belgium put this into practice, I don't know if it's 20 odd years ago, they also had the same safeguards, I imagine, in place, but that has slidden down. And I was just reading children as young as 9 have been able to access euthanasia. One of them, I believe, it was because they had maybe spina bifida and the life expectancy was only 30 or 40. And that's, where I'm afraid to go. But the other thing in my mind...
Ash, you realise that we are talking about the law in another country and the Victorian laws are extremely different, with many safeguards that would prevent that from happening.
I am very suspicious on anything that calls itself a safeguard.
So you're going... Your slippery slope argument.
I am a slippery slope, but it's not slippery slope in the fallacy sense, in that I'm looking at another country and I think we're following roughly the same ideology or the same fashions or fads. If that's not a rude word, I do apologise. But I guess the other feeling I have on this issue, if my grandmother or whatever was ill, I'd feel I was taking her to the vet. That's what we do with our pets when we put them down. I just think there's something fundamental about the human dignity, and once again, I'm a Christian, they're made in the image and likeness of God, that we care for our people at all costs.
Okay, Ash, I'm going to just pause you there because I'd like to go back to Catherine. You were talking about dignity and the dignity of people who are dying in terrible pain without the right to decide this is enough.
That's right.
So how does it feel listening to Ash talking about dignity?
I feel that in my experience, the people don't die with dignity. And I think with this new assisted dying law, that they will be allowed to die with dignity because it's their choice to seek this option. So I'm not really sure what you mean by your line in that regard.
I think there's something about the fundamental respect for human life and the Hippocratic Oath with the doctors that separates us. And I do think humans do sit in a different category to the rest of life on Earth. And, you know, maybe that's just my opinion. And it does shock me that safeguards are not, I am worried where it could go. But on that, I'm also worried about other people accessing healthcare in Australia and how they may feel about that. I remember 20 years ago when it was introduced to the Northern Territory, Indigenous people and also people of some of the ethnic minorities were very afraid to then access healthcare because they were worried about what the potential might be.
Okay, Ash, I'm going to draw it back to the other panellists, and Catherine, to start with you.
Yeah, look, I support the Victorian voluntary assisted dying laws. I think that there are 68 safeguards in place. They are very, the model that's been used is a very conservative model. I think anyone who has seen anyone dying of motor neurone disease, an absolutely hideous disease, has seen some of the circumstances of death. It's not pretty. It's horrible sometimes for people when you hear descriptions of people bringing up faeces constantly because they're unable to actually defecate anymore. It's horrendous, and the reality for many people's deaths is terrible. And I think as a nurse, Catherine, you would have seen many of that. The laws are very, very narrow. You do have to be able, you have to be of sound mind, you have to have had people signing off that you know exactly what you're doing, you have to be dying within the next 6 months and 12 months depending on the two narrow
and the role
areas.
of doctors.
And the role of doctors is absolutely critical. I heard someone on the ABC just the other day, a doctor who's done the training recently, and he talked about what an act of courage it's going to be to actually do this. He's nervous about it, he's worried about it, but believes very much for his patients that this is part of the continuity of care that he can provide. I think it's been a really brave step for Victoria to go down this pathway, and I think we'll see other states follow. Yeah,
Rex, what do you think? Will South Australia go down that path, for example, at some point? Will other states follow?
Well, I think we've recently seen in the federal parliament where we tried to give the right back to the Northern Territory to adopt similar laws. Unfortunately, that didn't pass. This is a matter of choice for people. As long as there are safeguards in place, we already have a situation where people get medical care that then switches across to palliative care, and I think this is just the next step, and I don't want to see anyone suffer. And as long as they are cognitive and making their own decisions, I think people should have a right to make a decision to end what might otherwise be a very painful and uncomfortable life.
Dan, what's your view?
It concerns me, Tony. I think the palliative care system in Australia works extremely well. I don't think there was a need to take this extra step. So I'm not in support of the euthanasia laws here.
And there's nothing the federal government can do to intervene, is there? I mean, there must have been a discussion. Obviously, there was an intervention in the Northern Territory in Canberra, but the states have the absolute right to decide, do they? There's no discussion at the Attorney General level of federal intervention, is there?
That's my understanding.
Well, the Health Minister did say that potentially in terms of the approval of the drugs through the TGA, that there was some potential that he may wish to do something around that. So, federally, there was some talk from your party, from your Health Minister, that there might be a chance to do something about that. So
I'll just finish answering the question,
sure,
if that's all right, Catherine. So with regards to the NT, it was very much you know, we had the ability to, because it was a territory. So my understanding is we don't have, on that basis, the right to look at what Victoria's done and in any way influence it. When it comes to medications that are used and getting approval for those, there might be some ability to do that, but I'm not sure how widely that's been discussed, looked at or addressed.
And if this trend began to, well, the new legislation took root in other states, Western Australia, possibly South Australia, unlikely Queensland, but possibly Queensland, would you then start to feel that this was a national problem that your government would need to do something about?
Well, I don't think you would call it a national problem. I think what you would look at and say, okay, well, each the states have their rights to bring in the laws as they see fit. But I think what you would find is people would look at this and say, okay, well, what is the direction that we're heading in? You know, should we be looking at palliative care? Is that a better option than euthanasia? And I'm sure that as a nation we would have discussions. One of the things that was very clear when the Victorian Parliament debated this, that it was a lot of thought, time and effort went into the debate. It was a debate that went over a period of days, so there was obviously very deep consideration that was given to this step, because in my view it is a major step. We have crossed a threshold. Now, it's not one that I agree with. It's one that we should be thinking very carefully about. I think that, you know, my hope is that other states and territories won't follow what has occurred in Victoria.
Sally.
I mean, I think we should be doing everything we can to keep people alive. You know, I think we should be funding hospitals. I think we should be putting drugs on the PBS and making surgeries, you know, available on Medicare. I think we should look at keeping people alive. And then when that doesn't work, we need to allow people to end their suffering. And I think it is like a deeply personal decision that people make as individuals and with their families. And I wish that the church would stay out of other people's lives.
Okay. We've got to go to other questions. We've got politics to deal with, among other things. So if you've got something to say while watching Q&A, you can join the audience, send a tweet or put your hand up to become a People's Panellist. We're looking for articulate citizens like Ash to join the panel each week. So go to our website to find out more about how to do that. Our next question comes from Jenny Fowler.
Thank you. My question's addressed to Catherine King. We now have the Labor Party saying a wage of $200,000 is not the top of the town, it's aspirational. Is Labor in danger of overreach in trying to placate the electoral base? Are we seeing a real shift in the Labor ideal of a fair go for all Australians, including those on very low wages, if it agrees to the whole package of tax cuts?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question, Jenny. I think there's a couple of things. Labor's deeply concerned about wealth inequality. We are deeply concerned about it. So when you hear us talk about what is happening with different incomes, it is about wealth inequality. Now, we've obviously got a tax package that the government's legislation is due to be, as I understand it, debated in the first week back in Parliament on the Thursday. We've accepted that stage one, we've said that all the way along, that stage one for low-income earners is actually really important. Today we've said on having finally got together to have a discussion with our shadow cabinet about it, that we think stage two, in particular we think part of stage two should be brought forward. And the reason we think that is that despite the fact that the government told us through the election campaign that the economy was strong, it is absolutely clear it is not. We are in trouble. We've seen wages continue to stagnate. We've seen, again, the Reserve Bank drop interest rates, again, to low levels. This is not something we've seen since the global financial crisis. So
you want to see, just to put that in a nutshell, you want to see the economy stimulated quickly
absolutely.
By tax cuts quickly.
Tax cuts
but
more quickly.
Today you've said you've ruled out the passage of the $95 billion stage three of the tax cuts.
We haven't ruled it out. What we've said is we think the most urgent thing before the Parliament at the moment is to deal with stage one, which was already meant to be in place. Stage 2 is not due to come into effect until 2022. That's when the next election is due. That, we think, if you bring part of that forward, will act as a stimulus to the economy. We also think the government has got a whole lot of infrastructure promises that will not happen for several elections away. We think you should bring some of that forward, and we think you should defer the decision about stage 3. But remembering that, in fact, the Parliament has already made the decision to flatten the tax rate between 90,000 to 200. That legislation's already passed. What the debate about stage 3 is about is the rate, whether it goes from 32.7 to 30%. That's what the legislation would be. That flattening of the rate has got legislated already. That's already passed the Parliament. What the government wants to do does not come into effect until 24-25.
Okay, so just the politics. The politics are that the government is saying they will not split up this effectively omnibus bill. They won't do that. So you're saying you'll hang tough all the way through and stop tax cuts from going through if necessary. Is that right?
We've said we're going to, here is a negotiating position. We think the economy is in trouble. Come and negotiate on this bit, which is due, which are immediate and 22, bring that forward. The ones for 24, 25, I mean, it's pretty heroic to try and say this is what the economy is going to look like now. We've said, can we defer discussion about that until later, even later in the next parliamentary session? Let's get these two stages through
Let's hear
first.
from the government representative. Dan, will you split up the bill in order to get quick passage of a series of tax cuts, which will potentially stimulate the economy?
Can I just say it was a very good question, and I think what it showed was that the Labor Party's approach to class warfare has completely and utterly backfired on them, and I think it's a good thing for this country now. We're talking about aspiration rather than terms like top end of the town, which was trying to drive envy. We took a long-term plan to the Australian people about cutting taxes. Now, a lot of people have come up to me and said, why do governments take such a short-term approach to things because of the electoral cycle? Why don't you set out a 5-year plan? Well, that's exactly what we've done. We set out a 5-year plan to reduce taxes. We took it to the Australian people. The Australian people have elected us. We now want to implement that passage. We want to implement our plan. And I would say to Catherine, and I know there's now indecision in the Labor Party about stage 3 and whether to support it or not, and that's been left unclear. Just do the right thing by the Australian people and let us implement our plan.
You keep talking about this mandate, but if I look at my seat, where there was a swing to Labor in my seat, I now hold my seat by more than you hold your seat by, the neighbouring seat. So what's the mandate? I mean, seriously, I am doing the right thing by the people who voted for me, and they are concerned about wealth inequality, and they're concerned about their jobs and their wages, and they think there should be stimulus.
Tony, this is important. I just want to tell Catherine the coalition won the election.
Yeah, we got that. I got that. We know that.
Catherine, we're doing my majority is bigger than yours anymore. Okay?
We know that.
The thing is, you're going to have to come to a decision as to whether to hang tough and reject the full bill or not. And it seems to me that you're saying it's a negotiating position which gives you the option of actually coming back and supporting the full bill, which goes back to the question, actually. So are you in a position to back down, or have you locked yourself in a position where you can't back down?
We haven't had a discussion about stage 3. We haven't had that discussion, and there's processes for that to do. We've made an offer to the government in good faith about a negotiating position. It is now in the government's hands to determine whether people will get tax relief quickly or whether they won't. That's their decision.
Rex, now you're sitting here in the middle of these two warring parties. You're going to be on the crossbench.
Keep them honest, mate.
Now, you'll be one on the crossbench that may actually, again, have to decide whether to push these tax bills through the Senate. That assumes that some sort of deal is done with Labor.
Yeah, look, we've been through this before.
Whether some deal is done with Labor or not, in fact.
Sure. Look, we've been through this before with the previous, this ending Parliament, where we had 3 stages of tax cuts. We rejected the third, sent it back to the lower house, and the government said no, it's all or nothing. I've spoken directly to Matthias Cormann on a number of occasions, and we're being told, and I have no reason to disbelieve him, that it will not be split up. And it's for that reason that Centre Alliance is now looking at ways in which we can move forward, making sure that with this very, very large decision, we don't end up in a situation where down track we end up cutting services to education, to health, and to aged care.
So you're saying once again there'd be a Senate inquiry. It would last a very long time, presumably. Before.
No, not at all. So we're in discussions. One of the areas that we have great concern is with energy costs. Pretty much energy affects every sector of the economy. It doesn't matter whether you're making fish and chips for a living, whether you're running a TV station or running a very large chemical company. And we've got very, very high energy prices here in Australia, particularly in my home state of South Australia. So we've been focusing on making sure that if we do move forward with the tax cuts, the Reserve Bank Governor has indicated that's important to get disposable income back into the economy to stimulate it, but we don't want to have that happen and then energy companies just gobble up all of the tax cut. And we also don't want an economy that is inefficient and uncompetitive because of our energy prices. So we have been involved in a discussion with the government, and I've had a discussion with Minister Cormann and indeed Minister Canavan about energy, and they're working through some solutions that may get us to a point where we can support this package.
Okay, I'm going to just ask the next question and come back to you. The next question comes to Scott Nash. It's kind of related to what we're talking about. Scott, go ahead.
Despite this country being one of the largest exporters of natural gas, Australian consumers and manufacturers are paying up to 40% more than Japanese users for the same Australian gas. Even energy company AGL thinks it can make money by building a gas terminal in Victoria and re-importing gas. As our manufacturing continues to dwindle and pensioners shiver through the winter, is it now time for serious action to bring the Australian gas cartel under control and restore sensible energy prices to our energy exporting nation?
I'll go back to Rex to start with and then along the line.
Sure, great question. You're right, we are paying more for our gas here in Australia than our Asian friends are paying for our gas that is exported to them. Back in 2013-14, Australians were paying between $3 and $4 per gigajoule for gas. We then entered into contracts and constructed some LNG trains in Gladstone. We are now exporting a substantial amount of gas. A couple of years after that, I was dealing with South Australian constituents who weren't saying to me, Rex, the price is too high. They were simply saying, we can't get an offer. The exporters took so much gas from the domestic market, we couldn't even get gas. Now we've got a situation where we've managed to control through something called the Australian Domestic Gas Security Mechanism, something Nick Xenophon and myself negotiated with the government back in 2017, that has made sure that we do have supply, but it's tight. It's a tight supply, and the cartel you're talking about, they're quite happy to keep it tight so that the prices are high. We have to do something about this. It is hurting individuals. It doesn't matter whether you're a pensioner, whether you're on New Start, whether you work hard for a living, whether you're a small business or a large business. These high gas prices are hurting.
Yeah, Catherine, go ahead.
Look, we'd support moves to have and develop a gas plan as part of a broader energy plan. I think the government, frankly, has failed to develop a broader energy plan, which includes clearly renewables as well. We've noted the comments that Rex has been making around gas, and obviously the strain that is on particularly our manufacturing sector here in Victoria, I think will continue to be a substantive issue. So it would seem a sensible thing to do to actually start to develop a proper gas plan for the nation. Again, not something we've seen from the government so far.
Ash.
Yeah, it's just an interesting one on gas, because apparently gas is about half the amount of carbon of some of the other fossil fuels. Apparently it's a fraction of the fine particulate pollution. And I actually listening to Radio National the other day on ABC, I heard the presenter there suggest that in the US, even after Trump's pulled out of the Paris Climate Agreement, that their emissions have kept going down purely because of they started developing the gas further. So in terms of the environment, it may be a good middle step before our renewables become more, I suppose, more accessible, cheaper to use and more reliable. It could be a good middle step, affordable step, and something that's better for the environment. So it could be quite good all round.
Very, very quickly. It is supposed to be the transitional energy from
I
coal through to renewables, and we have priced ourselves out of that.
It's ridiculous.
Dan Tehan, is it time to do something about this? It's an obvious, it's a strange phenomenon that you can buy Australian gas in Japan cheaper than you can in Australia.
So we are doing something about it, and I know that Rex has had detailed conversations with Matt Canavan, Angus Taylor and Matthias about this, about our plan to drive gas prices down. We've seen a 20% decrease in gas prices in Australia. What has led to the last 4 months, there's been a price reduction in Asia, which is less than what we've got here in Australia, is being produced by the US, and the amount of gas that they've brought on to the international market. Now, our hope is that that will see parity also here in Australia, so we'll see a further decrease in prices here in Australia. We will continue to work with the gas companies to put downward pressure on gas prices. We need to do that, but we do have a plan to get prices down, and I know there has been very detailed negotiations and discussions with Rex on that because we appreciate his interest in it.
Okay, remember, if you hear any doubtful claims tonight, let us know on Twitter. Keep an eye on the RMIT ABC Fact Check and the Conversation website for the results. Time for one last question. It comes from Neve O'Connor-Smith. Neve.
Hi. As a rural school student, my local high school, Castlemaine Secondary College, struggles to pay for basic things like educational materials and maintaining the buildings and grounds. We have a limited range of subjects offered, and we have no functioning ovals to play sport on. I look at other schools with so much more and ask, why doesn't the government properly support public education?
Dan Tehan.
Well, we do, Neve, and we're putting extra funding, we're putting record funding into public education. I last week signed a bilateral education deal with the Victorian State Government, which provides them from the Commonwealth record levels of funding for public schools, for independent schools and for Catholic schools. And one of the key things about that negotiation was making sure that the Victorian State Government does its bit, because what tends to happen, and this is why we've entered into agreements, the more the Commonwealth puts in and the faster we grow our expenditure into public schools, the state has a tendency to reduce the level increase of its funding. So what we've now done is tied them into an agreement where they have to increase their funding for public schools. And the sad reality is, in Victoria, the Victorian State Government is the lowest funder per student of public schools in the country. Now, we want them to lift that. We're putting in record funding. We want them to lift their level of funding. And my hope is, now that we've got this agreement in place, you'll see more funding flow into your school.
Just a quick one, Dan. What percentage of the funding that the extra funding that you're talking about, what percentage of it is actually earmarked to go to public schools?
So we are seeing a 60% growth in our funding for public schools in Victoria. So that is how much we're providing for them. Now, obviously, state governments are the predominant funders of state schools, and one of the things that we always have to do, especially from the Commonwealth level, and Catherine would know this from the health portfolio, is there is a tendency with the more money the Commonwealth puts in, the states will find ways to, if we don't put in place agreements, to reduce the level of growth that they put in to their system. So that is why we've had a lengthy, detailed negotiation with Victoria. But I'm pleased to say that although currently they are the lowest funder on a per student basis of public schools in the country, what we've done will see that start to increase.
Catherine.
Again, we've been through an election where the reality was the government, despite, this is how they describe it, is that, they say their funding's going up, and everybody can say that because, the way in which the agreements work is that the Commonwealth share is meant to be going up. But when you go back to what they said they were going to do back in the 2013 election campaign, it's about $14 billion less than what they said they were actually going to do. We know that public schools need more resources. The government has taken a decision, in fact actually untied the agreements with the states, and you're now tying them up again, which is good, to make sure that those state shares continue to go up. But it is less money than they promised when they first got into government, and that's what we're seeing across the country is there is less money than there should be for public education because we haven't followed the needs-based funding model that we worked hard when we were last in office to actually do and develop. We've had, as Dan quite rightly points out, we lost the election. We went to the election with a very strong platform to put that $14 billion back into education. We're not able to do that from government. That is part of the consequences of the election is there is less money for public education than there would have been under Labor.
Tony, can I just say, and I don't want to get into a big debate this, but $310 billion of extra funding is what we're putting in.
Ash? You're going to me on education. Well, my kids do go to a state school down on Phillip Island. It's a fantastic school. It is very well funded. So I guess I'm not as familiar with it. I do think funding needs to be very fair, obviously, across the board. I guess I could be concerned that where is the money going? How can we take money out of other programs that are less necessary and put it where we need to into the proper infrastructure and whatever? But yeah, I suppose I feel unqualified in that when I look at my local public school, it actually runs quite well. They're doing works at the moment.
And I guess this is one of the debates that Rex has alluded to as well about the tax cuts when you go back to that. If the government has less revenue in 2024 to spend on things like education, health, aged care services, and they're the decisions that you'll have to make in 2024.
Catherine,
if there's less
hang on, Dan.
That's the reality of the debate.
I do. It's just because when it comes to tax cuts, why don't we grow the pie? I actually don't get it. I run a small business. I run a very small business.
Growing the pie means more tax.
Well, no, it actually doesn't. If you get more people into work, and if for a business like myself, you cut the tax on the business, I can actually put more money into investing. I can put more staff on. Sure. It's less people paying more tax, and you actually disincentivise work if you put the tax creep up. It's I get quite emotional on this. I actually don't work a lot of hours because it is a seasonal business. But I'm not even slightly jealous of someone who may want to earn $200,000 a year. And you can check with my accountant there. My wages are quite low. But you do disincentivise work if you put it up. I'm quite happy for someone who wants to put the extra hard work in. They already pay more tax simply because they earn more dollars than me. Why should they have to pay more tax per dollar?
Okay, Ash, that was the answer you didn't get to make earlier. So appreciate you getting the chance to do it. Tony. Well, hang on a sec. Rex, I want to hear from you, and the priority of education funding, particularly in public schools in the regions, was what the question was about.
Well, I actually think there's lots of problems with regions, and the government hasn't focused on regions enough. We're seeing all sorts of declines in services in regional areas, and that has to be addressed. What I can say is that as any legislation comes through the Senate that seeks to cut education, it'll be getting a no from us, and we'll be putting pressure all the time on making sure that we get these services, get improvements to the services, get improvements where we can. That's one of the things the crossbench does extremely well, keeping an eye on the government and making sure that we get extra funding to schools like yours.
Dan, I'll give you 30 seconds right of reply because we're out of time.
We have guaranteed education funding for the next decade. I'm happy to step you through it, Rex. There will be no cuts, guaranteed education funding for the next decade.
Okay, on that little bit of cross-party negotiation, we'll have to leave it for tonight. Please thank our panel, Ash Belsar, Catherine King, Rex Patrick, Sally Rugg and Dan Tehan.